Welcome, everybody, to our brand new show, Crime, Corrections, and Culture, with the great Persephone and myself. We are on YouTube, we are on X, we are on Twitch. I really hope that people are going to be tuning in and joining us. We still accept the super chats and the super stickers, but we are going to discuss crime, corrections, and culture. And as somebody who has been a criminal and has spent a lot of time in prison, 25 years to be exact, I've studied the corrections culture both in person, both through introspection, and through a very lot of reading. So, for the first few episodes, what we're going to do on here is Brent McCall and I. That's Brent McCall. This is I. And this is the book that we wrote, Down the Rabbit Hole, How the Culture of Corrections Encourages Crime. And so for the beginning of the show, first few episodes, we're going to be discussing that book, which was, Brent and I wrote and published that. I think I want to say 2017 it was published. And, it was about what takes place in prison, our direct experience, but we also drew on a lot of literature to discuss what the correctional theory is based on and what prisons should be doing as opposed to what they're actually doing. And Persephone's going to be asking me some questions about it. I really think that you're going to enjoy this show, especially if you're interested in a no bullshit look at prisons. So, Persephone, what are you typing up there? You seem to be typing up a storm.
Sorry, I'm just dealing with something. Okay, so we're discussing down the rabbit hole. Um, so I had previously read View from a Cage, but I'd never read this one. And I started reading for the show, and just in the introduction, there were a couple of things that I found really interesting. Sorry, just give me 2 seconds.
You could have three if you'd like. I hope there's a lot more than just a few things that you found interesting, though.
So, one of the things that I found really interesting was in the introduction, you say this is not an expose on the cruelty, abuse, and neglect that are all too often associated with prisons. When
Right.
corrections personnel engage in that sort of behavior, it so clearly undermines the purpose and goals of correction that it hardly requires an elaborate explanation. It should
Yes.
be obvious to everyone that allowing government thugs to mistreat felons is not a correctional strategy, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yes.
So, just in the introduction, one of the things that is really apparent is that you're not talking about sort of the how do I phrase this?
Want me to do it
So
for you? I think I know what you're talking about. We are not interested. We are not interested in presenting prisoners as if they are victims of mistreatment or things like that. It's not that it never occurs. It's just that that is not the biggest problem in the correctional system. Is not that the staff are mean.
yeah, but it's that, but it's also a lot of criminal justice podcasts and shows. That's what they'll do, right? They'll talk about the corruption and the overcrowding and the abuse, but that's like easier to discount, right? Because if you are talking about abuse or you're talking about like trying to make my words be words, if you're talking about something so dramatic, it's a lot easier to not ignore, counteract. But you're talking about sort of relatively mundane stuff that happens that influences
Yes.
whether inmates can be reformed, not rehabilitated.
Right. So let me just say that when Brett and I wrote this, we knew we're two convicted felons multiple times over who have both spent decades in prison. Brent is still in prison. So we knew that our credibility would be suspect. So we made sure to write things that events that were on camera. so that anybody who wanted to go check could do so. Now, very importantly, we sent this book to various media outlets, various politicians, and had one delivered to then Commissioner of Corrections, Scott Semple. So, interestingly enough, and by the way, Brent and I wrote this book knowing that we, after being cellmates for 11 years, we would likely be separated. We were. We knew that there would be retaliation. There was. We knew that inmates would get mad at us. They did. And we knew that staff members would try to get us assaulted. They did. Now, fortunately, we never got assaulted, but the staff certainly tried. Not all staff by any means. I'm just saying there were isolated staff members who tried that. So, that said, we had the book delivered to Senator Len Suzio. He was a state senator at the time and very known for his tough on crime stances. So much so that Brent and I were hesitant to get him the book. The reason we were hesitant is because we didn't want him to cherry pick from the book to fit his agenda. Right? He was very much opposed to risk reduction earned credit, which is basically good time. And we didn't want him to just cherry pick and focus the stuff that was relevant to that. But it got to the point where nobody was listening to us, so we did get him a book. And it became a friend of mine. He spoke out for my release. He spoke out for Brent's release. Came to visit me at the prison. And once he came to visit, the staff retaliation stuff by and large stopped. But anyway, so Scott Semple, then Commissioner of Corrections, had his copy of the book delivered to Senator Suzio. In his copy, there were all kinds of Post-it notes. And what those Post-it notes said was verified. This is true. Yes, this did happen. Yes, this occurred. Over and over and over again. So much so that when Senator Suzio spoke on my behalf at my sentence reduction hearing, he brought the book and he showed it in court with all the original Post-it notes to say that what these guys said is true. So it was never a matter of, hey, look, these two guys, listen to what they're saying, trust them. It was always check and verify. If the DOC, Department of Correction, was going to call us liars, prove it. Right? Because we put ourselves on the line with dates and times and names in the book over and over and over again. And it wasn't like you're saying, it wasn't sensationalism. If you watch a show where inmates talk, much of the time it's pure bullshit what they're talking about. This is how it is, and the cellmate, and you got to do this, and it's bullshit. Virtually anybody in Connecticut, now because then the line's going to be, oh, but that's in Connecticut, and, in the other states you can't get away with it, with doing that. Never mind the fact that Robert Blecker wrote a book called The Death of Punishment, and in his book, now most people agree Chicago's a dangerous city, right? Chicago, Illinois, for the people listening. He talked about how the Illinois penitentiary, Statesville, they've nicknamed it Safeville because nothing is really happening. People are not getting killed. They're not getting stabbed. Now, look, I've seen somebody get his face sliced badly with a razor blade. I've seen people get assaulted. It happens. But by and large, prison is a mundane place. In my personal experience, and nothing that I've read would tell me any differently. For instance, when you're in Connecticut prison, for years they would say, back in the day, big saying, back in the day you wouldn't get away with that. Okay, I've read stuff from the 1800s about prisons in Russia where it was described the same way, where people were telling on each other. I've read stuff from the 70s, same thing. In the early 1900s, same thing, where inmates were telling on each other. I used to know a guy who, when people would talk about back in the day, it was so dangerous and so bad, this guy told them, you're full of shit. I was there. It was never like that. Now, does that mean that prison is never dangerous? Of course not. But I would be willing to bet that most of the people in this audience, if they were to go to prison, they would be relatively safe. Doesn't mean you're not going to get bullied or people aren't going to say mean things to you, but I mean, you're not getting assaulted, you're not getting raped. Again, not that it never happens. That is just not the norm for everyday life inside a prison. Now, I hope that didn't go on for too long, but that's my experience.
Yeah. I mean, my father was in prison and he'd spoken to me about, and I know it's different because, we're in a third world country. Um, but he was in a pretty, what in Cape Town is considered one of the sort of the rougher prisons. Um, and he didn't have any particularly horrible experiences.
My father
Um,
was in prison as well, as were numerous of his friends. I mean, I you know, again, I've only been in Connecticut prison, but I've done enough reading research to think that it's not that much different elsewhere. Although I know that the convicts, ex-convicts watching this are going to be screaming, "Ha, in Connecticut, yeah, you've never been here." And okay, maybe so. It might be true. I don't know. What I do know is that nothing in my experience or reading would lead me to believe that the vast majority of prisons in America are, you know, war zones.
so it's been a while, obviously, since you wrote this book.
Yes.
Have you gone back and read it recently?
Um, I don't need to. I mean, I know what's in it. So if
I
you
know you
ask
know
me,
what's in it.
I'm
I
just
know
saying,
you
if
know what's in
I know, I mean, not only did I live it, but writing and reading and rereading and proofreading and in and out. I mean, there's been
so
a ton.
just in the introduction, right? If you had to write this again now, is there anything that you would change or would you keep it the same?
Um, in the introduction or in the whole
Just
book?
in the introduction, because for anybody who goes and reads it, and by the way, I do encourage everybody to go and read it. The introduction, which is 19 A4 pages, um, does a lot of heavy lifting. Well, it does a lot of things at the same time because you're talking about what the book isn't. You're establishing credibility. You're talking about unconscious influence. You're talking about you're just there. The introduction does a whole bunch
Okay.
of things. Um, and I'm just curious if there is anything that you would do differently if
I
you were
don't think
writing this
so.
book now.
I don't think. I mean, I like I said. I mean, I haven't reread it to see that, to check. Oh, we could have done this differently or that differently. But by and large, I would say no. I don't think so.
Okay. So here's another thing that I highlighted. In many ways, these aspects of correctional culture are the most insidious precisely because they tend to influence the offender on an unconscious level. After all, a person can take steps to rectify that which he is aware of, whereas that which escapes his notice is free to wreak havoc.
Yeah.
Um, so you're arguing basically that the mundane stuff is more damaging
Well,
than
of
the dramatic
course,
stuff.
yes, because it's every day. It's your everyday life. So every day you're watching. If you're in prison, you're seeing correctional officers violate the rules that they're sworn to enforce. You're seeing other inmates. If you're trying to do right, you're watching inmates who are doing bad, often rewarded for it, or very least not punished for it. That's constant. You've got constant noise that's just bombarding you. So, you're in your cell and people are slamming dominoes off tables, they're yelling, they're screaming. That's every single day. One of the examples that I love to give of seeing people rewarded for bad behavior is this. So in prison, in the block I was in, it was what they call a working block, and we would go to work at what they call the prison industries, as I'm sure you've seen in this book here. And what would happen is you're supposed to get on a shower list after work, and then you lock up because you have two tiers, like you can see in this picture behind me. That's an upper tier. There's also lower tiers, and in the lower tier, In the top tier, they're separated, so you can't come out to rec together. So if your tier is not out for rec when you get back from work, you're supposed to get on a shower list. So Brent and I every day would get on the shower list and lock up. What would happen is nobody else would. So then everybody who didn't lock up when they were supposed to was able to shower. And then when they, on the shower list, they go by when showers are open, which they wouldn't be because people keep getting in. So by the time they get to us, it's much, much later. So we have to wait for hours to get a shower. Whereas the people who are breaking the rules are able to get clean, stay out of their cells, hang out. And when you're inundated with that, and that's just one example, but there's an abundance of situations like that. Day after day, those are the implicit messages that you're getting. First of all, everybody's corrupt. It's not just me. I'm in prison because I got caught, but the COs are just as corrupt as I am. So this is the way the world is. And, you are going to be rewarded over and over again for bad behavior, like deleting yourself from the stage. That is not a good signal to be getting every day. That bad behavior is rewarded, good behavior is punished. That's just not, and you're getting that all the time. So I had a debate with an ex-correctional officer on his podcast. Unfortunately, the quality of the podcast is horrible. I think it's called Highly Unoffended. So he and I were talking, and I told him a story where I had a conversation with a correctional officer who had been on duty for 20 years. And the guy he had read the book, and I used to talk to him. He was one of the better ones as far as abiding by the rules that they're supposed to, their code of ethics, their code of conduct. And he called me over and he says, Lieb, he says, come on. He says, you're a little too tough on him. He says, you got to admit that there are some good correctional officers. This is what the cop said. I said, how long you been on the job? He said, 5 years. I said, okay, name 5. Just 5. 5 correctional officers in 20 years that, judging by the objective criteria of their code of ethics and their code of conduct, what they're supposed to be doing, tell me 5 in all your years that you would call good. This is the response. Another correctional officer, he was pissed at me for writing the book. I'd known him for 20 years, I think, at the time. And he said, well, he was a little angry. He says, what about this? So I asked him, I said, listen, how long you known me? He said, 15, 20 years. I said, okay, in all that time, have I ever disrespected you in any way? He said, no. I said, have you ever seen me disrespect anybody? He said, no. I said, okay, now you can't know for certain the stuff that we claimed, whether it's true or not, because you're not there. But I said, would it surprise you that it's true? No. I saw that same correctional officer a couple months ago down at the coffee shop, and he gave me a hug, by the way. So when I debated this guy, I said to him, I've never met a correctional officer that obeyed all the rules. That was a good correctional officer by your own standards. He says, that's frivolous. I don't buy it. I said, okay, let's talk. I said, have you ever seen a staff member misbehave, violate the code of conduct? Yeah. I said, did you report him? Of course not. Right there, you're already not doing your job. Because it's your job.
Of course not.
No, he said he would just talk to him. You're not doing your job because it's in the code of conduct. When you see them violating, you're supposed to report them. You didn't. I said, you ever swear in front of inmates? Of course. There you go. There's part 2. You already are violating the code of conduct. Not even knowing this guy, I already knew that he wasn't in compliance with what they're supposed to be doing. So if you're an inmate and day in, day out, that's what you're witnessing, what is the message to you? What are you getting? You're getting that rules apply to some people, but not to everybody. And you're getting that inmates are being rewarded for bad behavior. Those are not good messages to be sending.
So you said You said, after all, there is little more futile than extolling the virtues of integrity and responsibility to a group of criminals while the institutional staff behave like a bunch of frat
Frat
boys
boys.
lording over their own little fiefdom.
Yes, hypocrisy does not make for a good argument.
Yeah. So I really liked that.
Well,
That
look,
was great.
correctional officers, men, will talk to inmates about the female officers they've screwed.
Gross.
And that's not like a once in a lifetime thing. That's relatively common, as is correctional officers sleeping on the job, which we've documented also in there. So, I mean, what are you going to do? This is not good.
Yeah, so that passage came after you spoke about how you were listening to complaints in group discussions in a reform program.
Right. So Brent and I were very big, and still I am, on individual responsibility, and that it's the inmate's responsibility to take the steps to reform himself, regardless of what the system does. I still think that. However, so Brett and I designed this program, the imprisoned program, and we ran it inside the prison for 4 years. And inmates would constantly say, yes, but the staff does this. Yes, but the staff does that. And we used to tell them over and over again, it's not relevant. It's you are responsible for yourself. But we couldn't just ignore the fact that this is providing a ready-made excuse for virtually every inmate in the system. So whether we think they should take responsibility or not, this is clearly an impediment to them doing so. So Brent and I were going to write a book called Ayn Rand and the Rehabilitation of Criminals because we found the philosophy of objectivism to be very helpful to us in our rehabilitation. But Brent says to me, dude, we can't write a book on rehabilitation when the prison system is this fucked because it's just not conducive to it. And I mean, I've seen studies that maybe 1 in 10 correctional institutions are conducive to rehabilitation. Those are not good numbers.
No, they're not good numbers. Sorry. Hold on, I need to go down to my other highlighted bit.
You do that. In the introduction, also, we note the impact that Dr. Stanton Samenow had on our thinking. Criminal psychologist, he's deceased now, wrote a review on the book because we relied, in the next chapter, we'll talk about the criminal personality because we thought that it was vital, and I'll restate this in the next episode for those who maybe don't see this or whatever. We thought it was vital that people understood that when you're talking about how corrections ought to be run, you need to understand the type of people who are going to be living there, the criminals. You need to understand that. So we relied on Dr. Samonow's theory of the criminal personality. He also wrote Inside the Criminal Mind, and he wrote a good review of our book. He wrote it in Psychology Today magazine. And in a personal email to my friend Subby, he said these two explain Dr. Samenow and Yokelson, the other doctor he wrote with, better than we do, meaning better than Dr. Yokelson and Samenow do. He also mentioned us in the last version of his main work, Inside the Criminal Mind. He referenced us in our book. So just for, again, the last part of the chapter, the introduction is called The Question of Credibility. So I would say that since the book came out, our credibility has only increased.
I have one more question because I have a hard out.
When is your hard out?
Like in 5 minutes.
Okay, half-hour show. All right.
It doesn't have to be a half-hour show.
Just today it's a half-hour show. That's what I meant. It's a half hour.
Today it has to be a half hour. Yeah.
Okay.
So what do you think, just from the introduction, because that's the only thing that I want to talk about today, what do you think is the most important takeaway just from the introduction?
The most important takeaway just from the introduction is, well, it's not just one thing. It's a couple things. One, I want to say that the purpose of corrections, and I don't know if it's in the introduction, but it's in the book, is incapacitation, deterrence, punishment, and rehabilitation. And prisons largely only do one thing. They incapacitate. It's not a real punishment. It's not a deterrent, and it sure as hell isn't rehabilitating anybody, right? So that's the first thing, is to understand that. And the other thing is that the stuff about prisons that's bad is not the stuff you're going to see in an episode of Oz or in some sensationalist documentary or a podcast that's hosted by a bunch of guys that are touting, how horrible prison is or how gangster it is. So while we don't mention that stuff specifically in the book, I would say that the introduction, if you're aware of those things, prepares you to understand that it is the everyday minutia of corrections that is the problem.
Yeah. So you specifically said that how the mundane operations of the prison and the relatively ordinary exchanges among staff and offenders tend to do much to confirm the offender's worldview, serving to reinforce rather than eradicate a major impetus to criminal conduct.
Absolutely. Well, that's why the title of the book is Down the Rabbit Hole, How the Culture of Corrections Encourages Crime. Because it isn't through violence, and it isn't through the, criminals get to know each other and then they build and they talk crime with each other and learn new things. That's generally not how it happens. It's generally, and it doesn't, notice that we don't say it causes crime, because crime comes within the offender. Right? These guys are already criminals. That's why they're there. But it does encourage crime in the sense that it does not encourage rehabilitation.
Do you briefly want to touch on the difference between rehabilitation and reform? Or do you not?
Dr. Samenow, he's correct on this. I've just stopped doing it because I find that it's an obstacle to the discussion, because rehabilitation is so entrenched. Rehabilitation literally means returning you to a previous state of functioning. And criminals have never, by and large, had a good original state of functioning, right? We were always fucked up. I mean, unless you're going to bring us back maybe to when we're 3, right? So rehabilitation is a misnomer. So he used the word habilitation. We thought that was clunky, so we used the term reform. But I'm ultimately okay using rehabilitation because the argument's just not worth it.
Yeah, okay. I thought it was interesting when I read that. We've got 2 more minutes. Mr. Deagle asked if you'd ever seen Shawshank Redemption.
I've seen Shawshank Redemption. I've talked about the Norway prison system with somebody that worked within it. And I've read books that included it in there, Mr. Deagle. I am well informed on this topic. I'm well equipped to discuss it.
And we'll be sharing the Amazon link. It is on Amazon.
Yes. Are you going to put it in there, or do you want me to go find it and do it?
No, I'll go do it.
Okay.
So we'll put the link to Down the Rabbit Hole in the underneath of this video, and also share on Twitter. So if you do want to purchase and read along, you can.
Yes. Unfortunately, this book is not in a Kindle format, but you can purchase it in hard copy. Sorry, we were in prison when we did it. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. It was a real nightmare getting this book published.
But it's really worth reading.
Yes, that's true. It is worth reading. So it's going to be 3:15 Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays for this show.
Yes.
Right? I would have done it every day, but Persephone's a slacker. So no, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays for this show. And I hope you will all be joining us live. And if not live, watching at least the recording. So we will see you again here on Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us in our inaugural episode.
Bye.